Inflation is at a 40-year high. Tariffs are driving up prices. Headlines like these have been bombarding us for years, and both topics, tariffs and inflation, seem to pop up everywhere from news channels to dinner table conversation. But have you ever wondered how exactly these two economic forces are connected? Do tariffs really cause inflation, as some claim? Or is the relationship more complicated? In this video, we'll break down the connection between tariffs and inflation in a way that actually makes sense. You'll learn what both of these economic forces really are, how they interact, and what it means for your wallet. We'll cut through the political noise and media hype to understand the genuine economic relationship at play. Think of it like connecting dots on an economic map. Once you see the pattern, you'll never look at those news headlines the same way again. Let's get started. Section 1. Understanding tariffs and inflation individually. Before we can connect tariffs and inflation, we need to understand what each one actually is. Let's start with some clear definitions. Inflation is simply the rate at which prices increase over time. When inflation is at 5%, it means that on average, things cost 5% more than they did a year ago. Your dollar buys less than it used to. Inflation affects nearly everything: groceries, housing, healthcare, you name it. It's like a silent tax that erodes your purchasing power bit by bit. For example, if bread cost $2 last year and now costs $2.10, that's a 5% increase. Now imagine that price increase happening across thousands of products and services throughout the economy, and you've got inflation. There are three main types of inflation that economists talk about. Demand pull inflation happens when consumers have lots of money and are willing to spend it, pulling prices upward. Cost push inflation occurs when the costs of production rise, like higher oil prices or wage increases, pushing prices up. And monetary inflation happens when there's too much money in circulation relative to the goods and services available. Now let's turn to tariffs. As we covered in our previous video, a tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. When the US puts a 25% tariff on Chinese electronics, it means those products face a 25% tax when entering the American market. Countries impose tariffs for several reasons: to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, to raise government revenue, or as political leverage against other nations. Whatever the reason, tariffs make imported goods more expensive in the domestic market. For instance, when the US imposed tariffs on washing machines in 2018, the average price jumped from $749 to $840 in just a few months, about a 12% increase. That's a real impact on consumers' wallets. So on the surface, there seems to be an obvious connection. Tariffs increase prices on imported goods, and inflation is rising prices. But the relationship is actually more nuanced than that simple equation suggests. Let's dive deeper into how these two forces interact. Section 2. The direct price effect. How tariffs feed into inflation. The most obvious connection between tariffs and inflation is what economists call the direct price effect. When a country imposes tariffs, imported goods become more expensive, which directly contributes to inflation. But how significant is this effect? Let's look at some real numbers. When the US imposed broad tariffs in 2018 and 2019, studies found that the direct effect on consumer prices was noticeable but limited. One analysis by the Federal Reserve found that those tariffs likely added about 0.5 percentage points to the US Consumer Price Index. That may not sound like much, but when normal inflation targets are around 2%, adding half a percentage point is significant. It's like trying to lose weight but sneaking in an extra cookie every day. Small additions add up over time. The direct price effect works through three main channels. First, there's the immediate price increase on imported final goods. When tariffs were placed on imported washing machines, consumers saw price tags jump almost overnight. Second, there's the ripple effect on domestic competitors. When imported washing machines became more expensive, US manufacturers like Whirlpool could raise their prices too without losing customers. Studies found that domestic washing machine prices rose by almost the same amount as imported ones after the tariffs, about 12%. That's not a coincidence, it's a direct market response. Third, there's the impact on parts and components. Many domestic products are made with imported materials that might be subject to tariffs. A US furniture maker using Chinese steel or a candy manufacturer using imported sugar will face higher costs, which often get passed on to consumers. Take the 2018 steel tariffs. Even though steel might seem far removed from your daily purchases, it's used in everything from cars to appliances to construction. When steel prices rose by nearly 40% following the tariffs, it affected prices across multiple industries. But here's an important point. The direct price effect of tariffs tends to be concentrated in specific sectors rather than causing broad inflation across the entire economy. It's more like spot fires than a widespread blaze. For tariffs to cause significant nationwide inflation, they would need to be very broad-based or focused on essential inputs used in many industries. So that's the direct price effect, the most visible connection between tariffs and inflation. But there are also indirect effects that can amplify this relationship, which we'll explore next. Section 3. Supply chain ripple effects, the multiplier impact. Beyond the direct price increases, tariffs can trigger what I call the supply chain ripple effect, which can multiply their inflationary impact. Modern economies rely on complex global supply chains, where components and materials cross multiple borders before becoming finished products. When tariffs disrupt these chains, the inflationary consequences can be far greater than the tariff percentage might suggest. Let me explain how this works with a simple example. Imagine a smartphone assembled in the US with parts from China, South Korea, Japan, and Germany. If the US imposes a 10% tariff just on the Chinese components, it doesn't just affect those parts. It can disrupt the entire production process. Companies faced with tariffs have three main options, all potentially inflationary. First, they can absorb the costs, which reduces profits and might lead to higher prices elsewhere to compensate. Second, they can pass the costs directly to consumers. Or third, they can restructure their supply chains, a complex and expensive process that also often leads to higher costs. Apple provides a real-world example. When faced with tariffs on Chinese imports, the company had to consider moving some production to countries like Vietnam or India. Such transitions cost billions of dollars and take years to implement. Those costs don't just disappear, they eventually find their way to consumers. Another important multiplier effect happens through what economists call intermediate goods, products used to make other products. When tariffs hit intermediate goods like steel, chemicals, or electronic components, they can cascade through multiple stages of production, with each business in the chain potentially adding its own markup to the tariff-induced cost increase. For example, a 10% tariff on steel might lead to a 10% price increase in steel, which then leads to a 5% increase in the cost of car parts, which then contributes to a 2% increase in the final price of a car. At each step, the initial tariff impact gets magnified. Studies of the 2018 to 2019 tariffs found that these supply chain effects amplified the inflationary impact by as much as 2.5 times the direct effect. For consumers, this means that even modest-sounding tariffs can pack a significant inflationary punch when they work their way through the economy. But here's where it gets interesting. Supply chain disruptions can also lead to longer-term structural changes that might be inflationary in the short run, but could reduce inflation in the long run. Let's explore that contradiction in our next section. Section 4, the broader economic response, short versus long-term effects. When it comes to tariffs and inflation, timing matters. The short-term effects often look very different from the long-term consequences, creating what economists call temporal disconnects in the economy. In the short term, say the first 6 to 18 months after tariffs are imposed, the inflationary effects we've already discussed tend to dominate. Prices rise on imported goods, domestic competitors follow suit, and supply chains get disrupted. This is when headlines about tariffs driving inflation are most accurate. For example, in the months after the 2018 tariffs, researchers documented price increases across affected product categories. Washing machine prices jumped 12%, solar panels increased by about 16%, and products using steel saw price increases of 5 to 10%. But over the longer term, 2 years or more, the economic picture gets more complicated. Several counterbalancing forces come into play that can actually reduce the inflationary impact of tariffs. First, higher prices typically lead to reduced demand. When washing machines get more expensive, people buy fewer of them or delay their purchases. This demand reduction can eventually put downward pressure on prices, partially offsetting the initial inflation. Second, markets adjust and find alternatives. When Chinese furniture faces high tariffs, retailers might switch to suppliers from Vietnam or Mexico. These adjustments take time, but can eventually mitigate price increases. Third, currency markets respond. When the US imposes tariffs on China, the Chinese yuan often weakens against the dollar. This makes Chinese goods cheaper in dollar terms, partially offsetting the tariff effect. After the 2018 tariffs, the yuan depreciated by about 8% against the dollar, effectively neutralizing nearly a third of the tariff impact. And fourth, companies adapt their production methods. Faced with higher input costs, they might invest in automation or find ways to use less of the tariff materials. Toyota, for example, developed techniques to use less precious metals in their catalytic converters in response to rising metal prices. These long-term adjustments help explain why some studies find that the inflationary impact of tariffs tends to peak within a year and then gradually diminishes. By year 3, the effect might be half of what it was initially. But here's the critical point. If a trade war escalates with continuing rounds of new tariffs, the economy never reaches that adjustment phase. It's like trying to recover from a sprained ankle while someone keeps kicking it. The healing process can't complete. This helps explain why the 2018 to 2019 tariffs, which kept expanding in scope, had a more persistent inflationary effect than economists might have initially predicted. The timing of tariffs relative to other economic conditions also matters enormously. Let's examine that in our next section. Section 5, the economic context, when tariffs matter. Most for inflation. The impact of tariffs on inflation isn't constant. It varies dramatically depending on the overall economic environment. Think of tariffs as adding fuel to a fire. How much that matters depends on whether you're dealing with a small campfire or a forest already ablaze. 3 key economic factors determine how significantly tariffs will affect inflation: the current inflation rate, the state of supply chains, and monetary policy. First, let's consider the existing inflation rate. During periods of low inflation, like most of the 2010s when inflation hovered around 2%, tariffs can cause noticeable but manageable price increases in specific sectors. However, during already high inflation, like the 7 to 9% rates in 2022, tariffs can amplify existing inflationary pressures and make the problem significantly worse. It's like adding a 5-pound weight to someone already carrying 20 pounds versus adding it to someone struggling with 100 pounds. The same weight has very different effects depending on the starting load. Second, supply chain conditions play a crucial role. When supply chains are running smoothly with excess capacity, companies can absorb tariff costs more easily or find alternative suppliers. But when supply chains are already strained, as they were during the COVID-19 pandemic, tariffs can exacerbate bottlenecks and magnify inflation. For example, the tariffs imposed in 2018 to 2019 had a significant but contained inflationary impact. However, had those same tariffs been implemented during the supply chain crisis of 2021, their inflationary effect would likely have been 2 to 3 times greater, according to economic models. Third, monetary policy makes an enormous difference. Central banks like the Federal Reserve respond to inflation by raising interest rates. During normal times, they might counteract tariff-induced inflation with minor rate adjustment. But if inflation is already high and central banks are aggressively tightening, tariffs complicate their job and could force even higher interest rates. In 2023, for instance, economists warned that introducing new tariffs while the Fed was battling inflation could force interest rates even higher, potentially increasing mortgage rates and loan costs for consumers and businesses. Now let's put all this together with some real-world examples. The 2018 to 2019 tariffs were implemented during a period of low inflation, under 2%, relatively stable supply chains, and accommodative monetary policy. Their inflationary impact, while real, was relatively contained, adding perhaps 0.5-1 percentage points to inflation. By contrast, implementing similar tariffs in mid-2022, when inflation was at 9%, supply chains were snarled, and the Fed was rapidly raising rates, would have had a much more dramatic inflationary effect, potentially adding 2 to 3 percentage points to an already painful inflation rate. This context helps explain why economists' views on tariffs and inflation can seem inconsistent. The same tariff policy can have dramatically different inflationary consequences depending on when and how it's implemented. Understanding this context is crucial for evaluating claims about tariffs and inflation in the news. So who ultimately pays for tariffs? Let's find out in our final section. Section 6. Who really pays? Consumers, companies, or countries? We've talked about how tariffs affect prices and inflation, but there's still a crucial question: who actually bears the cost of tariffs? Politicians often claim that foreign countries pay the tariffs, but economists have a different answer. Let's follow the money. When a tariff is imposed, it's technically paid by the importing company when goods enter the country. For example, when a U.S. retailer imports Chinese furniture with a 25% tariff, that company initially pays the tax to U.S. Customs. But that's just the beginning of the story. What happens next depends on something economists call tariff incidence, how the tariff burden is distributed among different parties. Think of it like playing hot potato with the tariff cost, where everyone tries to pass it to someone else. Research on the 2018 to 2019 tariffs provides a clear answer to who typically ends up holding the hot potato. Multiple studies, including those by the Federal Reserve, found that nearly 100% of the tariff costs were passed on to U.S. consumers and businesses. Almost none was absorbed by foreign exporters lowering their prices. For example, when washing machine tariffs were implemented, prices rose almost exactly by the amount of the tariff, suggesting consumers paid essentially the entire cost. Similarly, studies of steel and aluminum tariffs found that U.S. businesses and consumers bore over 90% of the cost. This contradicts claims that China is paying the tariffs. In reality, U.S. consumers and businesses paid an estimated $80 billion in additional costs due to the 2018 to 2019 tariffs. That's about $600 per household per year. But the cost distribution isn't completely one-sided. Foreign producers do face some losses, primarily through reduced sales volume rather than lower prices. Chinese exports to the U.S. decreased by roughly 25% due to the tariffs, representing lost sales and potentially lost jobs in China. So while they don't pay the tariff directly, they do feel negative effects. The incidence of tariffs varies considerably by product, however. For goods where consumers have few alternatives, like specific medicines or specialized parts, importers can pass along nearly 100% of the tariff cost. For products with many substitutes, like certain foods or basic consumer goods, producers might absorb more of the cost to stay competitive. Another factor is market power. Large retailers like Walmart can sometimes force their foreign suppliers to absorb some tariff costs, while small businesses often have to pay whatever price the market demands. All of this means that tariffs essentially function as a regressive tax. They take a bigger percentage of income from lower income households than from wealthy ones. This is because lower income families spend a larger portion of their income on goods, many of which are imported or contain imported components. When tariffs raise the price of necessities like clothing, appliances, and food, it hits family budgets unequally. A $50 price increase on a refrigerator represents a much bigger burden for a family earning $30,000 than for one earning $300,000. So while tariffs might protect certain industries and jobs, understanding their inflationary impact helps us see the less visible costs they impose across the economy, particularly on consumers who often end up footing most of the bill. Conclusion. In conclusion, the connection between tariffs and inflation is real, but nuanced. Tariffs do increase prices. That's literally their mechanism of action. But whether they create significant economy-wide inflation depends on their scope, timing, and economic context. We've seen that tariffs affect inflation through direct price increases on imported goods, ripple effects through supply chains, and broader economic adjustments. In the short term, tariffs are definitely inflationary, but long-term market adaptations can reduce their impact over time. The economic environment crucially determines how much tariffs matter for inflation. The same tariff policy might be a minor concern during stable economic times, but a major problem during already high inflation or supply chain disruption. And despite political claims, economic evidence clearly shows that domestic consumers and businesses typically bear most of the cost of tariffs, not foreign countries. Understanding this connection matters for all of us. When you hear debates about tariff policies, you can now look beyond simplistic claims and consider the broader economic picture, including the potential impact on your own cost of living. In the complex dance between trade policy and economic outcomes, tariffs and inflation are indeed connected. But like most relationships in economics, it's complicated. If you enjoyed this explanation of tariffs and inflation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And let me know in the comments which economic concept you'd like me to explain next. Thanks for watching Stickonomics 101, where we make economics stick.